No matter how you feel about them, the royal family are synonymous with Britishness, right up there alongside fish and chips and complaining about the constantly bad weather. Millions worldwide will tune into major royal events like weddings, coronations and funerals. They're recognised worldwide, with thousands flocking to public appearances in the hopes that they'll catch a glimpse of them. But underneath the surface, this family has, allegedly, experienced an unusual amount of paranormal activity. And the stories span generations, from potentially warnings of impending disaster just before the outbreak of World War II, right through to nowadays in the reign of King Charles. Could these encounters have been mere coincidences with rational explanations, or is something more unearthly going on here? And with most of the royals living in residences that are hundreds of years old, are we actually surprised that they've witnessed these alleged ghosts? Originally, this episode was going to be about the history and hauntings of Buckingham Palace, but the more I researched about the royal family in general, the weirder it got, and we need to talk about it. So let's just start with Buckingham Palace itself first, the whole reason I started the research in the first place, which took me down some strange rabbit holes. The building originally started life as Buckingham House, built by a guy called John Sheffield, who would later become the Duke of Buckingham, hence the name Buckingham House. In 1762, though, it was purchased by King George III, who wanted a private family home for his wife, Queen Charlotte, and their kids. And it was literally informally referred to as the Queen's House, not to be confused with another London royal residence called the Queen's House, which is in Greenwich, a few miles down the road. In 1820, work began on turning the house into a palace, and it became the official residence of the monarch in 1837, when Queen Victoria came to the throne. And it's remained that way ever since, and each reigning monarch has officially lived at Buckingham Palace, alongside some other potentially more paranormal residents of the building, perhaps. And the most famous Buckingham Palace ghost is that of a brown hooded monk who has been seen wandering the hallways, usually around the West Terrace, and he's wrapped up in chains. If you were to bet on what type of ghost is haunting a place, especially in the UK, you couldn't say Dick Turpin or any white, grey, rainbow-coloured lady. Your next guess is a hooded monk, isn't it? But apparently, the story with this entity is that way back before this site was occupied by any manner of stately home, there used to be a hospital here for women who were suffering from leprosy, which is a really contagious bacterial disease that causes sores on the skin, damage to your nerves, and can actually lead to disfigurement. These patients were looked after by Augustinian monks who wear brown, and they lived nearby. See, now it's all starting to make sense why there's a hooded monk there, right? The hospital was knocked down when King Henry VIII decided that he wanted a lodge to go along with his deer park that he'd created in the area, and that's how St. James's Palace started out. Basically just a hunting lodge built on the site of an old leper hospital. But an interesting little factoid for you, the hospital was called the Leper Hospital of St. James the Less, and that's how the park, St. James's Park, and of course St. James's Palace, got its name. The more you know. But as for the ghostly monk, we don't specifically know who he is, why he's in chains, and why he's wandering around Buckingham Palace. But there is another ghost apparently haunting the palace too, that of a guy called Major John Gwynn. The story with him goes that he was serving as the private secretary to King Edward VII when he started going through some personal problems at home. These personal problems eventually led to a divorce, something that was absolutely not the done thing in the early 1900s, so it was a bit of a scandal. Things all got too much for John, and apparently he unfortunately ended his life by shooting himself in his office in Buckingham Palace. And now, again apparently, the sound of a gunshot has been heard echoing through the building. Obviously, this is a very big deal and not something that the royal security team would like to hear in the palace, so it's obviously thoroughly investigated, but they can't find where this noise came from. I would just like to throw in here though that throughout my research I did not come across the name Major John Gwynn, and the private secretary to King Edward VII was actually a guy called Francis Knowles. Maybe John just worked in the private secretary office instead? Maybe? Just wanted to put it out there. And while we don't have any specific accounts from the royal family saying that they've definitely seen a ghost here, no complaints from the king about hearing ghostly monks shuffling along the corridors, I've included it because some people believe that the reason our late Queen Elizabeth and now the king aren't really super keen on the place is because of the ghosts, and not at all because of the drafts, the fact that it's a super busy building and they're just living in it, or that they have a full-time pest controller working there to deal with the mice infestation. No, No, absolutely. Couldn't possibly. Must be the ghosts. Anyway, on to more specific witness accounts from the royal family themselves. The next story comes from Sandringham House in Norfolk. The house came into royal possession in 1862 when Queen Victoria brought it as a country home for their eldest son, Albert Edward, who would eventually go on to become King Edward VII. I've had enough of you under my feet now. You're 21 now, Bertie. It's time for some independence. Here's your own 2,800-acre estate to go spread your wings and live your life a little bit. And if, like me, you were wondering why he was called Albert but reigned as Edward, great minds think alike, right? The reason was because he wanted to. He didn't want to undervalue the name of his dad. He wanted Prince Albert's name to stand alone, so he was known as Edward VII. But ever since then, it's been a really well-loved estate by the whole family. It's where they spend their Christmases, like all of that. It is also where King George V and King George VI both passed away. But while it is still a beloved country home for the royals, it's not without its ghosts. One of which the king may have had a run-in with when he was younger. So apparently back in the 80s, the then Prince Charles was hunting around for some old prints in the library of Sandringham with his valet at the time, Ken Stronach. All of a sudden, they felt the room go icy cold. Despite being in an old house, it was enough for both of them to notice because it was accompanied by that dreadful feeling that you're not alone and that there's definitely someone standing right behind you. Charles was reported to have shouted out, "Oh heck," which is absolutely something I can imagine him saying, before he grabbed the first print he saw and they both legged it out of there. But something I did find exceedingly sweet about Sandringham was that apparently back in 2000, Queen Elizabeth actually held a religious service there to pay tribute to the restless souls still haunting the place, sort of as a way to pay respects to those who were maybe still hanging around the house. But it also screams exorcism to me, or when you get a priest to bless your house to try and get rid of whatever's in there. Because allegedly, the whole thing came about because the servants would refuse to work in certain rooms, particularly the bedroom where Elizabeth's dad, King George VI, had been found dead in 1952. Apparently, the vicar did feel some sort of vibe in one of the rooms while he was going about doing this service. And Queen Elizabeth herself, the Queen Mother, and the Queen Mother's lady-in-waiting were all part of this too. They were all following the vicar around while he worked. But it's not just the house itself that we need to talk about, because there's also the allegedly haunted Anmer Hall, which is also part of the Sandringham estate. And it was the private country home of the now Prince and Princess of Wales, William and Catherine, and their kiddos from 2015. I think they still do use that house now as well, so they clearly weren't put off by any talk of ghosts. In actual fact, when he was told that Anmer Hall was thought to be haunted, Prince William allegedly replied back saying that no old house is complete without a ghost, is it? Which, yep, fair enough, got a point there, does tend to be the way. Apparently, Anmer Hall is haunted by the ghost of a Catholic priest who is thought to be Sir Henry Walpole. The story with him was that he was actually born at Anmer Hall, but after turning to Catholicism in a time when it wasn't a great idea to be an out loud and proud Catholic, he was executed in 1595 after refusing to take the oath of supremacy, which is basically where he would have had to swear allegiance to Queen Elizabeth I, the supreme governor of the church. He just didn't want to do that, and so he was hanged, drawn and quartered for it. And so now it appears that he's come back to this place, and he's been seen wandering the corridors and also out in the garden. Some sources say that Prince William and Catherine have actually witnessed this ghost and heard his voice, but I couldn't find any other sources to back that up. What are you supposed to do if you're a ghost haunting a royal though? Like, should you bow? Should you curtsy? Or has Walpole got into a little bit of trouble with the monarchy, which led to his sticky ending? Does he just spit in their eye or something? I'm asking the real questions here. But if we go a little bit further north though, to Scotland, and while Dumfries House isn't a royal residence, it is one that does deserve a mention here. This one only became connected to the royal family in 2007, and it isn't actually technically owned by them. Basically, this house that was built in 1759, looking all very Georgian in architecture, it came up for auction in 2007 in a bit of a sorry state. It had seen better days, and the then Prince Charles, he caught wind of it. Deciding that he didn't want some over-enthusiastic entrepreneur to try and open a golf course which would inevitably fail and leave the house in an even more dilapidated ruin, he stepped in to save it. He created a consortium, which just means a collection of different organisations and things who all banded together to purchase the property in its entirety, furniture and all, like literally everything in the kitchen sink. And while he doesn't live in it, it's not a little Scottish holiday home or anything like that. It is included in this episode because of Camilla. Once the sale of Dumfries house had all gone through, you could say it was in need of some TLC quite urgently, and so renovation work started all throughout the building. Obviously, Charles went up to have a look at how things were progressing with the renovations, and Camilla joined him on one of these trips. And she actually talks about what happened the first time she visited Dumfries house in a documentary interview about her, so this isn't just tabloid hype. She said that as soon as she walked up those steps out front and got into the main house, she just froze. She had that instinctive gut feeling that she just could not move any further inside that house. It was just viscerally wrong. And so she avoided coming back to the place after that for a good few years while it was undergoing its renovation. And then once the work was all complete and the house was ready to be opened up, Camilla came back and had the complete opposite feeling. Whatever had affected her in such a negative way the first time she was there had completely gone. Good vibes all around from the house the second time around. But there are so many stories like this though, where a house can be totally fine, but as soon as you start doing work to it, like ripping out the kitchen or painting the walls, things get weird. That even kind of happened to my parents once. They never really had a weird encounter or anything in the house they were living in at the time, until this one time they started doing DIY in the living room. They were there taking the wallboards off when all of a sudden a perfect circle of plaster came off the walls with it. Okay, quite annoying, turning into a bit of a bigger job now. Thank you, house. Isn't that always the way with DIY though? You start something and then the job just goes wrong and morphs into something that you'd wish you'd never started. Anyway, nothing particularly ominous about this inconvenience, just a circle left on the wall where the plaster should have been. Whatever, right? They finished up for the day and Dad went back to work on Monday, so they couldn't carry on with the plastering until the next weekend, and so this circle was just there in the living room. And that's when something weird started happening, particularly to my mum. And we're not talking horror movie level hauntings or anything like that, but still, it's enough to stick in their minds almost 30 years later. Reasonably often, if my parents are watching something on TV that, say, my mum isn't particularly interested in and it's getting late, she'll just say that she's going off to bed to watch telly before going to sleep. But once this plaster palaver had happened, my mum would go up to the bedroom and she'd find that the TV was already turned on. Okay, bit strange, and considering that TV was only ever really used to watch something just before bed, it's doubtful that anyone would have been watching something in there during the day and just left it on. But you know, not impossible. You could knock the remote while you're making the bed, the cat could have walked over the remote and turned it on, anything like that. But what was even stranger was that when Dad would eventually come up to bed, the TV would be off and Mum would be asleep. Which, to the outside world, that just sounds like a complete non-issue, but if you know my mom, you know that she never turns the TV off before she goes to sleep. She just falls asleep. That is just the natural law of the universe. It has always been and will always be that way. So much so that that's why it's so significant that Dad remembers coming up and the TV being off. And according to my mom, this happened once, maybe twice during that week, but that wasn't the only incident. Apparently, when she was going up into the loft one night, similarly to the TV, the light was already on, ready for her, although no one had been up there for days. Again, rational explanations abound. It could have been left on all that time. I don't think that would have been likely, knowing my parents, but not impossible. The weekend rolled around though, and so my parents, they got straight back into the DIY and proceeded to replaster over this circle. Finished up the room, job's your uncle. But my mum never had another encounter like that in that house ever again after the circle of plaster was put back up. My dad remains convinced that there was some other explanation as to why the TV kept on turning on and off, plus the loft light, old wiring, anything like that. But in an old house, pre-1900, so there would have been almost 100 years of history in that house, maybe something was disturbed by that ring of plaster and was just helping Mum out for a little bit. We'll never know. But the point I'm trying to get at is that maybe it was something that was disturbed during the renovations at Dumfries house that gave Camilla that feeling. Albeit she did not have as benign an experience as my mum did, but do you see what I mean? It would be really interesting to know if any of the people working on the renovations experienced anything while they were there. But Dumfries house does have a bit of a reputation for being haunted anyway. Apparitions have been seen, and even a phantom coach and horses was heard in 1900, the night before the 3rd Marquess of Bute, John Crichton Stewart, owner, who owned the house at the time, passed away. And there's also the story of a smelly ghost who haunted the building. They're not seen, only, as the name would suggest, smelled. And it's pungent and follows people around, usually when they're on a tour of the house or something. Interestingly though, this phantom smell was never smelled again once the renovations were done. Was this maybe the entity that Camilla picked up on? Or was it all just a coincidence and the house was just in desperate need of someone to sort out the dodgy plumbing or something? But I've saved probably the most infamous until last, the exceedingly haunted Windsor Castle. And Windsor Castle, this place deserves an episode all on its own. There is so much going on here. I mean, it was first built by William the Conqueror in 1070, so you know we've got centuries of history and drama for me to fill you in on. So maybe one day we will come back to it if you fancy it, but there were a couple really interesting stories that I wanted to share with you just to do with the royal family themselves. And the first one is one that I actually hadn't heard before, and it dates back to 1936 as Edward VIII was king, famously only king for 10 months before abdicating the throne so that he could marry the twice divorced Wallis Simpson. And it was Wallis who had mentioned to Edward that she'd wanted to do a bit of landscaping work to the gardens at Windsor Castle, specifically some spruce trees. They had to go, she wanted them removed. These spruce trees had been planted there by King Edward's great-grandparents, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, so, you know, they were significant. But Edward is king now, so what he says goes. And so workmen were brought in to get the job done, only they weren't able to. Apparently, as soon as work had started, weird things kept happening that kept them from pulling the trees out. Maybe just some inconvenient coincidence, right? Until, allegedly, these workmen, on attempting again to get these trees removed, witnessed the apparition of Queen Victoria herself moving swiftly towards them, waving her arms and moaning loudly. That is just an image that could either be absolutely terrifying, you know, the horror movie trope of like sunken black eyes and a mouth open larger than it should be looking horrific, or it's the first time she's ever had to bother doing a haunting and she doesn't quite know how to play an effective ghost, so one of the other entities haunting the castle is trying to show her what to do, with hugely comedic effect. Either way, the trees were left well alone after that and are still standing in the gardens of Windsor Castle now. But Edward VIII isn't the only royal to have apparently had encounters at Windsor Castle. The library seems to be a particularly active spot, and the apparition of Queen Elizabeth I has been seen walking through this area on multiple occasions by multiple royals. Queen Elizabeth II and her sister, Princess Margaret, they've both seen the apparition. I saw someone claim that King Charles has seen her too, and then Charles's granddad, King George VI, he apparently saw this apparition of Queen Bess 8 times before the outbreak of World War II. Maybe trying to warn him that something big was about to go down? Because it seems almost like Queen Elizabeth I has potentially returned to a place where she was exceedingly fond of in life, continuing to look over the monarchy, check and make sure everything's all good. But like I said, there is so much more I can say about Windsor Castle, including a much more recent sighting that is very interesting. So let me know in the comments if you want to hear about it. But with Windsor Castle, a bit like Sandringham, it's not just the main building that has these ghost stories surrounding the royals. Although this one may just come down to your own beliefs, I'll leave it up to you to decide. I wanted to tell you about the Royal Lodge, which sits in Windsor Great Park, so not technically part of the estate, but, you know, close enough. It's been used by various members of the royal family over the last 100 years or so. After William IV, Queen Victoria's dad, came to the throne in 1830, and the whole place was demolished and rebuilt. It's probably most famously known as the house that the Queen Mother lived in for 50 years after King George VI passed away, and she actually died in that house in 2002. But now, it's currently being leased from the Crown Estate by none other than Prince Andrew, who still lives there with his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson. But there was a really interesting interview I found with Sarah, as once the Queen passed away, she and Andrew actually adopted her 2 remaining corgis, Sandy and Mick. And I don't know about you, but I always just love seeing the Queen with her corgis, like a little 4-legged entourage. Or when she was riding her ponies, I loved it, absolutely loved it. But in this interview, Sarah goes on to say that the pups are doing really well, all good, but she made a passing comment about the dogs sometimes barking at seemingly nothing that anyone else can see. As though she kind of made this connection that maybe it's the Queen coming to check in on her beloved dogs, make sure they're behaving and not chasing too many squirrels. And so it looks like for all of the lavishly decorated residences and the elite security at all times, maybe even the royals aren't immune from a good old-fashioned haunting. Unless you think otherwise and it's all just made up tabloid nonsense, nonsense, which, if you did think that, totally fair. I did tend to put a little bit more stock in the stories that I could verify that hadn't come from the Daily Fail and places like that. But say Camilla's experience in Dumfries house, that came from an interview where she was speaking on camera, saying that she was adamant that it was a ghost. You see what I mean? You see the difference? But either way, I had fun putting this one together. I've done quite a few heavier topics already this year, so it was nice to do something a little bit different. Not totally serious, but not unserious at the same time. Although this one was a lot more challenging than I thought. There was a lot of misinformation out there about who owns what and when they lived there. So if I've made any mistakes, just let me know and I'll put a correction in the comments, as I do with all of my videos where someone spots something not quite right. I do also want to shout out Richard Felix, the paranormal historian here too. A lot of the different ghost stories actually came from him, and he's had a few health issues lately, but seems to be just about back on his feet now, so we're all glad that you didn't decide to become a ghost, Richard. And while this one was a little bit different to what I usually do, I still came across so many ghost stories in pretty much all of these places. Like I said, with Windsor Castle, Sandringham has a bunch more too, and then obviously you've got Kensington Palace and St James's Palace as well. So let me know if you want me to do a series on haunted royal homes. You just say the word, I'll do it. And that's the reason I wasn't quite as rigorous on the history as I would have been with this one, aside from the fact I would have been talking for hours. But as for all of my thoughts on this, I mean, come on, it makes sense, right? You hear stories of staff members who work in historic buildings experiencing things that they can't explain. But I mean, of course you do. They spend more time there than most people. And so they're more likely to run into a ghost at one point or another. And so then the same logic extends to royals who live at these old residences. They're bound to hear and see things that they can't explain. And then aside from that, you always hear of people being visited by loved ones from beyond the grave. And so again, with the royal family, a lot of the time, they live in a place where a relative has passed away at some point. So there's some logic there too. Obviously, on the other, more skeptical side of things, you can't discount the fact that they are old buildings, maybe drafty, like Buckingham Palace apparently is. These places are also busy. There may be staff members who work for the royal family milling about that they don't know are on the other side of the wall or things like that. And then, of course, the lack of verifiable sources. So where I could, like with Camilla, I got her interview, but a lot of it does come from what tabloids say. So it's always the requirement to add in a big old fat pinch of salt when you're forming your opinions, just all things to bear in mind. I will just say as well, a lot of people also have a lot of strong opinions on certain members of the royal family and whether you can trust anything that comes out of their mouths. That is your own beef. I'm just presenting everything that I've found for you to make your own minds up on what you believe. And I say all of that because I'm going to be mentioning some specific members of the royal family next week who elicit a very strong response from a lot of people, both good and bad. Because I'm not actually done talking about the royal family just yet. We are getting weirder next week. Oh, I have a lot more to tell you about. We are just getting started. So if you enjoyed this video, let me know by clicking like. It's just such a small thing, but it really does help me out. And if you like what you've heard from me today and you're not already, maybe you'd want to subscribe too. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and have a drink of water. Please keep yourself hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious, and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I've just got ready to record and then you start screaming. You come barreling in here, ruin the set, and demand loves. I just can't even be mad at you. No. The life of a cat. It's perfect.